Go ahead and get started then. If I might call all of our attentions to me momentarily, but then to be passed along, everyone pay attention to me. For those who don't know me, I'm Lisa Acme James. I'm the Dean of the Cathedral, and we are in the midst of, as some of you will know, or some of you are learning, in the midst of a series in Lent where we are focusing on how it is that God comes to us and how we come to God through the vehicle of arts. And now I've done my hard bit. I'm going to introduce the chair of our Arts Council. And seriously, Michael Stauffer has been a helpful leader over the last probably year or so.
Actually, yeah. Last May was when I did one of these things, and that thing started. So.
That's right. And so I think we've had a bunch of nascent, art-loving, God-approaching through the arts people here. Michael's been helping us to give language to that and give direction to that. So I'm going to ask him to introduce our speaker for the day. Thank you, Michael.
Yes. So I hope that you've had an opportunity to walk around and really engage. I don't want to say observe or look at, because that's what I'm trying to get you away from doing. But actually taking the time to engage with the individual images. Yes.
Go get them to shout.
Yes. Okay. I'm good at shouting. Projecting. Okay, so do take time to really try to engage with these icons. I think that's what makes, and I'm sure that Matt will be talking about that somewhat this morning as well, the individual icons and what that experience can bring to you, and that's what we're hoping this experience, the whole small exhibit, but I think a very worthy exhibit. We've given you a few tidbits to think about that might help you understand some of the individual images and the whole idea of iconography a bit better. So I commit some time over the next, they're going to be up through Easter, so it gives you an entire month. You can take this icon today and that icon next time and spend some time with it, which is, I hope, what you'll do. So when I was told that we had the opportunity for a whole series on using art as a way to engage God and investigate that sort of connection at this point, I thought there's nobody better to have come down here to talk about icons than my friend Matt Milliner. Matt and I taught at Wheaton together, he in the art department and me in the theater program. Well, you came in 2011? Yeah. Okay, so he's been teaching art history at Wheaton since 2011, so almost 15 years at this point. He established himself as a major go-to person in terms of scholarship in the arts at Wheaton, in the country, the world at this point. So it's wonderful to have him come and talk to us about it. Tell me the name of the book that you just finished again.
Mother of the Land.
Yes, okay. Which is dealing with icons and iconography, which I'm sure he will be referring to. Just one little side bit, just in case you think you're going to have to put up with some academic aesthete this morning. Don't be afraid, because one of the reasons I think that he works so well doing this kind of thing is he has done an excellent job of trying to make really heady information incredibly accessible. I remember this, and you will when I jog your memory. Several years ago, I had him work as a dramaturge for me on a play that I was doing, and I asked him to help me better understand Dada art at this point, which of course he was able to do quite easily, but I wasn't expecting him to come in to talk to the cast with a lampshade on his head. So he really understands what he's talking about, and more importantly, understands how to make it accessible, and even more important than that, is an incredible man of God who practices art. So, thank you, Michael.
It's such an act of hospitality to invite me here. I'm so grateful for the opportunity and to both be here and even to preach. I was like, wow, what an incredible, I looked at the readings and I said, I can't say no, it's the most exciting readings maybe of the year. So a chance to kind of, and to spend a lot of time with these icons. I was given, I'm so appreciative for a PDF of them, and now I get to see them in the flesh, and they're with us, and we're surrounded by them, which is the perfect setting. There's not a better place to be talking about these. And what I want to say to begin with, and I'm going to be scanning the room looking for hands that might pop up if there are things that are said that you might have a question about. But what I would like to say is, it's your tradition too. This is do not think of these as foreign objects, right? Alien images from Russian Orthodoxy. Tarasios, a Greek Orthodox person, was a patriarch, an archbishop of Canterbury once, long ago, in England. And so there's a long tradition of relationship between Eastern Orthodoxy and this great Anglican tradition that we're in, sometimes mutually tethered, opposed to Roman Catholicism. There are different ways of doing Christianity. We united with that. So it's your tradition too, these icons that are around us. Now, we could talk about the theology of icons, and I'm tempted to do that. And we could say that these are windows, not walls. They're intended to put you in touch with the prototypes, with the actual living entities, which most art exhibitions are incapable of suggesting. But we Christians believe that the membrane between the here and the hereafter is porous, and therefore these icons direct us to actual personages. Right? John the Baptist is a real person. Mary is a real person. They intercede for us on the other side, right? And so that's what the icons are doing. Once you get that, they're not aesthetic objects anymore. They then become portals. So that's one of the ways to understand them. And in our Western traditions, the stained glass window communicated that so well. But in the Orthodox tradition, it is the icon that does that same work. They weren't as specialized in stained glass, but these are their windows nonetheless. But instead of just a theology of icons presentation, fun as that would be, and we can get into it, I couldn't resist the Russian temptations of going into the political context of how these icons came to be. And so we're going to jump maybe even a little bit into current events as we go forward. And I think sometimes disconcerting ways that icons are used today. And so I'm glad they're harbored in this room. I'm not sure what would be happening with them if they were still in Russia, or if they would even exist if they were still in Russia, for a variety of political reasons we'll get into. So what a wonderful refuge that these images have found in this church. So have you ever seen a chart like this? No. So what we've got here is, this is the true Orthodox Church, the Russian Greek Orthodox Church, and that's real Christianity. And then you've got these different heresies that break out. And this says the papacy, Roman Catholicism, breaks off from the true church in 1054. The split between East and West. And then you have Protestantism here fractured, it says, into thousands of groups. Yes. That's us. We're the problem. And so when Orthodox priests come to Wheaton College campus, which they used to do, not as much anymore, and they would try to convert these evangelical students, they would say, see, this is the real church, and you are protesting Catholicism, but you've got to return to the true church. This is the claim that is often made. And I remember looking, this is a chart, and we're here, Protestant Episcopal Church, and these are all the endless fragmentations of Protestantism, showing that God is not with us as we fragment further and further. We must go back to orthodoxy. And I simply want to respond to that as we begin by saying this is a chart of orthodox divisions. Okay? And it's endlessly complicated. And anyone who's really studied orthodoxy will come to the conclusion, and I'll just zoom in a little bit here. Okay? Zoom in on this one here. You've got a schism in the 17th century of the old believers. Old believers. They were worried about the way that so I just want to point this out, not to point fingers and say, we're the true church, and all you Russian Orthodox need to come over here to St. James, but simply to say that a pox on all our houses. Forgive us, Lord, for our divisions. But there's not a pure communion that is preserved from this. And this is the context, 1600s, where there is a split that I think can explain these icons. And it's probably not familiar to you. You probably don't think about it every day. I didn't until I was preparing this presentation. And I found it fascinating to learn about it. And this is the guy. He looks kind of intimidating. Patriarch Nikon of Moscow. And Nikon was very heavy-handed, hand in glove with the Tsar, Okay? And really one of those bishops that loves to be in control and almost feels that the church needs to graduate to the level of statehood. And in so doing, he adopts some ecclesial reforms that cause more conservative believers to panic. Does this sound familiar? This is a situation that happens often, which causes these splits. And this launches the old believer tradition in Russia. The old believers. And this is the way that they depicted Patriarch Nikon. He is smashing icons to the ground. Not a Protestant. No, it's Nikon himself. Because of the aggressive liturgical reforms that he permitted, and they defiantly say, no, we want our own churches, we want our own places, we don't consider you to be authentic as a bishop. So this happens in Orthodoxy. They say that's only our problem. No, it's their problem too. And this occurs, and what does it have to do with icons? A whole lot. Even though Patriarch Nikon was against these westernizing Renaissance forms of icons that are coming into Russia, he sometimes is given the blame for allowing that to occur because the old believers break off, and this monastery, Solovetsky Monastery in Russia, there was an 8-year siege, military siege, at this monastery where the old believers refused to give it up. I mean, this is, again, with the kind of the news about Orthodoxy that often doesn't come to us because they're immune from some of those political challenges when they come to the United States. Sieges. I know monks on Mount Athos that, based upon the prospect of even meeting with the Pope, set up booby traps around the Athonite monasteries themselves to keep the Greek military from coming in. And there's a level of politicized intensity to Orthodoxy. And understanding this reality helps us to understand these icons. The painterly manner of Western-inspired icons, these are great new books about all of this, a lot of scholarship around this material, was met with stiff opposition by the leading old believers who hated Patriarch Nikon. They refused to venerate naturalistic-looking icons, and they condemned the erosion of the sacred Orthodox tradition. Now, Nikon himself also didn't love it, but he's blamed. And this occurs, and then the restrictive attitude on the part of the old ritualists would prove life-saving to the sacred image. What the new scholarship has said is that thanks to those old believers, these icons had a fighting chance against the extremely tempting, westernized, Renaissance, realistic aesthetic. Do you understand? That's the thing. So you can feel the old believers in these icons. We don't like these innovations. We don't want to be a bunch of Raphaels. We want to paint in the old Russian tradition. But, and here's the key, they fail. This is the traditional Russian icon. You can see a sense, 17th century. It resembles these to a certain extent. These are mostly late 19th century. And that is the way that icons were made. But look what happens. These are the wanderers, the Perevizhniki, Russians who wanted to be like those Parisian artists, the fashionable Parisian artists. And look how they painted. There's Moscow in the Renaissance style. This icon is putting you in touch with the heavenly personage. You can almost feel St. Sergius here. You can pray with him. You can look ahead. This is his life story, like a sacred comic book all around. But now you look at Moscow in a Renaissance perspectival way, and you observe religious processions instead of participating in them yourself. Do you see the one move of distance? That's the temptation of the Renaissance aesthetic. Now, when you think of an Orthodox church, I wonder what you think of. Probably not this. This looks like our Capitol building. It looks like St. Paul's Cathedral in London. It looks like a pagan temple. And it's an Orthodox church. This is in St. Petersburg, Russia. And look at the inside. What happened to the simple gold background? You can feel the old believers who rebelled against Patriarch Nikon saying, that's what happens when you succumb to Western aesthetics. And we look around here, you can see, that doesn't look like an icon to me.
That looks like someone trying to ape Michelangelo and Raphael. And that's exactly what it is. Now we're in the late 19th century, the caving in of orthodoxy to this aesthetic. Sculpture, freestanding sculpture. The Orthodox always had flat icons so that you wouldn't be tempted toward idolatry. But now the sculpture is saying, you don't need to believe Christ is here. It's like the golden calf. This is concerning, deeply concerning to those old believers. See, we were right. Russia has gone the way of the West. Look at these icons. They almost feel sentimental and sacred. They have lost the great tradition of more traditional aesthetics that put you in touch with the prototype and not pretending that it's all right here. You see? And look at this. Oh, I was excited to find this. There's our match. So that's the icon of the ruler of all, the Pantocrator, and that's right a fresco from St. Petersburg. So now we have to say these icons are both holding on to the old aesthetic and capitulating to it, right? We're going to make a Jesus that looks like all those Jesuses in the West. Let's look at a few more here. Here's our John the Baptist. I really love this one. Because this John the Baptist is holding on to the old aesthetic as long as it can. And the angel wings are often depicted in ancient icons of John the Baptist because they convey his angelic nature as he went off into the desert. This is a pun on messenger and angel in Greek. He is the messenger of God, and so angelos, that's what the reference is. And so you see he's holding on, but oftentimes John the Baptist would be holding his head in traditional icons. What is he holding here? Did you catch it? Did you see? What's he holding? A chalice. With what in the chalice? The little baby, right? The little baby. The real presence of Christ in the Eucharist. You don't need an argument about transubstantiation. That's what's here. Little baby. Jesus is really there. And so I love this image. But again, you see the challenge of the aesthetics that's being resisted here. Look at these two. We're looking at St. Nicholas and the Trinity. They're both right there. And I'd like just for a moment to compare two of them. So here's your transfiguration over there. Okay? Now compare it to, this is a transfiguration from 1516, right as the Renaissance are going on, classic Russian iconography. And what's interesting, what's different about it? Blue sky, not the gold background. We've given up on that, right? And it's not even a very good blue sky, sort of a rather naturalistic one. And these disciples here are relaxed. They don't seem too disturbed, do they? But here, these disciples are knocked over by the uncreated light. And please know that that's the birth of abstraction, long before New York City abstract expressionists. There's abstraction back there. And you know what those symbols represent? The uncreated light of the Trinity and the undepictable darkness of God. We know that's what these icons are trying to represent. I'm not mocking your icons here and saying these are better. I'm saying, can you see and feel the temptation to succumb to Western aesthetics? You can feel it. I can't ask for a better representation. Look at the baptism. Now this is a doozy. So where's our baptism here? It's right over, there it is. Okay. Okay, we got a big add-on. What's the add-on? Compared to Andrei Rublev's original, again, 1405, the famous Russian iconographer, Andrei Rublev. What's different about these two? Huge difference.
Patrons.
Some might say catastrophic.
On the left and the right, there's added people.
Mm-hmm. And it is God the Father depicted.
At the top, yeah.
What? I thought he was beyond sight. You know that idea that lingers around? This is the God that many atheists don't believe in, right? I don't think God is some bearded guy hovering about Saturn. Well, neither do I. I'm a traditional Christian. But now there's a painting of God. God never became incarnate in the first person of the Trinity. And yet the Russian church begins to allow that in official councils. And this is interesting. You know why they allowed it? I'll tell you. Because they knew it betrayed their best principles, because God is beyond vision, beyond sight. Even though he became incarnate, that's allowed. You can depict Jesus,
but not the Father. Why did they allow it? Because if you disallowed it, what would you be accused of? Protestantism. Church disunity is what made this possible. And so that is, some might say, a great betrayal of the earlier mystical understanding of icons. And then there is the Mother of God. Now, these icons are larger, they're beautiful, and the stories it is a wild ride, so buckle up, okay? Here we go. Here we go. Let's tell this story of these two icons. Mary is without a child, and she is pointing and she is holding a message. And to understand these two icons, you can see the Russian Bogolubskaya, the Bogolubskaya icon of the Mother of God. It is hard to understand how complicated these two images are. So we're talking about one here and one there. And again, we'll just go really quickly. We have to understand an ancient relic, the belt of the Virgin Mary, or the sash of the Virgin Mary. And I want you to imagine you're there at your mother's funeral. And someone holds up the sash and says, Mom gave this to me just before she died. And your heart is moved. What a precious treasure that would be. Maybe some of you have had that experience. And the Christian church has said that happened at Mary's funeral. So there's an image that goes back, something that Mary herself wove. That's the story that this icon goes back to. And then that story gets associated with an icon, the Agiosoritisa, which is from the urn where that special sash was kept in Constantinople. Right, where it was like, once you got the sash of the Virgin Mary, it was held by Constantinople for a while. And finally, there's a prince that gets connected to this in Russia. Again, it is complicated. There is no easy way to understand this. Let's walk through the story very briefly. This is outside Jerusalem. And this is the funeral of the Virgin Mary happened in this underground chamber. You can visit it. It's right outside the main gate. And the story is that when Mary was being assumed into heaven, all of the apostles showed up, but good old Thomas, we know what's going to happen with him. He was late to the resurrection appearance, and he's late to the funeral too. I mean, come on. At least he's consistent. We can give that to Thomas. You go down here, and you'll see depictions of this event. And what you've got here are two icons in the east and the west of Mary saying, Thomas, I know you're late, but just as I'm assumed into heaven, here's this beautiful sash. She gives it to him here, and you can see the connection in the west here. It's a wonderful tradition. If you are disbelieving of it and skeptical, I invite you into the skepticism transcending faith on the other side of naive credulity. And think to yourself, maybe it has symbolic resonance, whether or not it actually happened. Maybe there's something precious about this sash. It is a complicated story. I know of no art historian who's able to boil it down into a book. But you see this icon in Rome. It's one of our earliest, and she is without child. She is pointing. That also is connected to this strange event. The icon is connected to the relic. That's what I'm suggesting. And here is the palace in Constantinople where that urn was kept, where Mary's sash was laid, and this icon is connected to it. And these are some reconstructions. I love these reconstructions of this imperial palace in Constantinople where that icon and that precious sash of the Virgin was placed. Then there is a Russian prince in the 12th century who gained some political power. He loved God, he loved Mary, and he also gets connected to this icon. Again, I wish it was simpler. Welcome to the complexities of art history. And so you see, sometimes Prince Andrei is depicted with this icon because he grew
in love with this image of the Virgin Mary connected to that palace in Constantinople, connected to the place where Mary gave her sash to Thomas. Isn't it a wild and wonderful story? But we're not even done with it. So you see the connection there. See why she looks that way? It's connected to that relic. And then, I know, I wish it was easier. Now, that largest part of the belt is kept on Mount Athos, one part of it, and there's another part that is kept in Florence, right outside of 12 miles outside of Florence. So if you went there, you would see they claim their part of the belt of the Virgin Mary, the sash of the Virgin Mary. You can go see it if you don't just want to do the art-loving thing. And then on Mount Athos, at the Vatopedi Monastery, they claim to have it all connected to this particular style of icon. Again, wild and complicated story. And let me just show you some of the images. This great monastic republic of Mount Athos, that is the massive Vatopedi Monastery itself. It's like a little city. And now we're getting into, here are some people coming to venerate the sash of the Virgin Mary. And these men, it looks like in this photograph, they're on a boat because women cannot touch the Athenite Peninsula. It is one of the rules of Orthodoxy, which is why at Wheaton we take replicated icons from Mount Athos and we present them in our classroom to let men and women also enjoy them. Nevertheless, so that's these wild stories of Orthodoxy, and here are the men venerating the cincture, the sash of the Virgin Mary, all connected to that icon. And I said we would get a little bit political. There was a New York Times story about the belt of the Virgin Mary, the sash, going on tour in Russia, in Russian chill, waiting hours for a touch of the holy. And there is Wheaton himself. He was the first to be given the opportunity to venerate this famous relic. All connected to this. And that's one of the reasons why I say this is our tradition as well. I know the way these icons are used in Russia, and I want their ownership here to be a reminder that they transcend political temptations. All this to say, complicated stories in regard to these icons. We're going to do one more and then we can talk a little bit about the revival of icons that happens, that's going to contextualize these. This one, we're right over here, and this icon has a fascinating history to it. The Artiskaya icon of the Theotokos, the Mother of God. And interestingly enough, some people would look at the exposed hair and say that this is unusual, but this is in fact, this is a current icon on auction that is an exact replica of your icon here. This is actually the original form of this icon. It goes back in this case to the 1700s. And the story, we are in Okitira, and you might look at that and say, that place is experiencing some conflict of late. Look at where it is in Ukraine and Russia. And you'd be exactly right to make that connection. Both sides of this current conflict will deploy these icons for their own purposes and also go to them for protection, for a heavenly reality that transcends the conflict. It is a richly complicated understanding to see these way these icons are deployed. And the story is that there was a man who had a miraculous experience with this image, and there were healings. And I love it. Actually, they went to wash the icon, okay? And then they heard a message, use that water with which you wash the icon to heal people. And it worked. And so many people came to be healed by that icon, and that's how that icon became famous. Just because of washing it. So these icons have miraculous properties often. And as a modern person, I have seen enough, and I'm sure you've seen enough too, that might be true. You can be credulous about that, I admit it. It's always a miracle. It's not always. They're not always painted by St. Luke when people claim they're painted by St. Luke. He probably didn't paint any of them. I'm an art historian, I know that. But the miraculous power of icons, inexplicable. I have seen a myrrh-bearing icon. There was no lever that someone was pushing. I don't know what to make of it. They go on tour. They just start to make, watch out for any myrrh gushing that might happen here. And if it does, maybe it's a good sign. Wild stuff. So all this to say, that one is particularly important. It goes back to a miracle icon. But I want you to look at something here and be puzzled. Because here is the Orthodox Church in America website talking to you about the Mother of God of this part, Oktira, also called Aktir. And what is the difference between the two of them? What happened to this icon? Does that look like the original to you? She put her hair up, she put a veil on. Why? Because of an extraordinary development in the 20th century that now Orthodox Christians will say, wrongly, that this is the way you do icons. In this case, the original had the exposed hair. But because now you have an understanding of the Orthodox, is that the old believers were right. We resisted the great Russian tradition. We capitulated to Western aesthetics, and then we rediscovered our own tradition. This is the only way you can understand the Art Institute of Chicago. I'm not kidding. If you don't know what I'm about to say, which most art lovers don't, I don't think you'll understand the great third floor of the modern wing. How could you understand Marc Chagall without understanding Russian icons? He said that's what inspired me. Let me explain. In the West, primitivism was somewhere else. In Russia, says Alain Besançon, it was within. Look at this. Henri Matisse. Never had I seen such a revelation of mystical feeling, sometimes even of religious dread. Your churches are admirable. Visit to Moscow. Majestically grandiose. As for the icons, they are a sampling of the most interesting primitive painting. Nowhere else do I see purity of color, spontaneity of color. We must come here to be instructed. 1911. Now you get it. That's third floor modern wing. That's the most important Matisse in the Art Institute of Chicago. Look at the dates. 1910, he starts it. He doesn't know what to do. And then 1911, 13, he experiences Russia. And now he has the liberty. Oh, forgive me. Now he has the liberty of abstraction. He learned it from the icons. And you might say, Matt, I don't get it. You're telling me that Matisse was inspired by the icon, but you also just told me that the old believers kind of lost and everything's westernized. What gives? The gift of icon restorers. These are my two heroes, Pavel Florensky and Sergei Bulgakov, two great Russian theologians now translated into English. Yes, we need a movie, and we know the actors that should play them. Okay, we do. Adam Driver and Pedro Pascal. I'm hoping it will happen. Okay, but all this to say, I love these. These are the guys that helped theologically lay the groundwork for the rediscovery of the icon. These are the books that I recommend to you. Altar icons, the avant-garde icon, all this new scholarship. It wasn't possible during communism to do this scholarship. Now we can finally investigate. And that is the icon of Andrei Rublev's Trinity. There it is. And then they did this too. Sometimes with a pocket knife. The heroic work of restoration. And they said, oh, we failed. The old believers were right. We gave up our tradition. This icon actually has Abram and Sarah there kneading the bread. I think it's a nice detail. But Andrei Rublev in the 1400s said, you're Abraham and Sarah. And you are to encounter the Trinity in what is sometimes called reverse perspective, the opposite of the Renaissance. You're not in control here. You're being gazed at by love. You have to bear the beams of God's love, as William Blake said. They discovered it. That's what Matisse saw. He went to the Russian icon show where they unfurled these and they said, what a mistake. And that gave us modernism? Really? Yes, that gave us modernism. I grew up, oh, modernism, that's where it gets godless. Are you kidding me? That's where it gets godly. Right? Where we go away from attempts at controlling the world into icons that put us in touch with the heavenly prototypes. Another example. So look at the contrast, right? It's good. And I'm glad the old believers were holding on. But wow, did we discover something new. Another one, the Virgin of Vladimir was uncovered. I'm referencing in the text Chirikov, who's one of the most heroic restorers. This is an act of art in and of itself. And look at the contrast. That's why the Orthodox Church in America says this is what real icons should look like, because they've been influenced after that reform, right? And they know we've rediscovered the tradition. Now, here's a quick map of what happens to the icon. So here's the wanderers, there's the icon show, and then Russia goes through hell. World War I was bad enough. They were just getting started in their catastrophic loss of life. And that horrific gash, 1918 to 22, after the West is finally piecing itself back together, then they had their Russian Revolution. And what happens is this icon's rediscovered, and the atheists come along and say, it's ours. We cannot win back the Russian soul if we don't make those icons on our own. And this is the great contest that defines icons in the early 20th century. How are we doing for time? We got a little time, we're okay?
About 8 minutes.
Lovely. Okay, we're going to keep going. All right, so this goes on, and the way to understand it is there's the great battle. The way I sometimes describe it is on one, you have a tug of war between the two. The communists know as they gain victory that the only way they can win, you want to see a terrifying image? Bam. Right? Is if we can harvest the great Russian icon into our politicized aesthetic that will fuel the communist resurgence. And Pavel Florensky, our Russian Leonardo, he is sometimes called, leads the fight. Trotsky is on record saying, who's that priest? He still has his cassock on. Doesn't he know that the communist revolution has happened? And they say, oh yeah, that's Pavel Florensky, but he's actually quite competent, so we let him get away with that. Tell him to come to the engineering conference today, but don't wear that cassock. And Florensky says, no cassock, no paper. And Trotsky says, okay, you can come. He gives a paper that blows the audience away. And it ends with a rousing applause. He defies this revolution. He was the most brilliant student in mathematics at the University of Moscow in generations. They offered him a professorship as he graduated. He said, no, becoming a priest. Sorry. That's Florensky. And he gives us a Russian Orthodox recovery of the icon. He defends the aesthetic of the old icons. Now, what happens when a particularly brilliant Christian makes a case when you're not supposed to make a case? That happens to them. They throw him into a prison camp. That Solovetsky monastery became the prototype for the gulags. They cast him there. He encouraged his fellow prisoners as they were being led to their death. And they shipped him to Siberia, and they were about to kill him. And you know what he said? He's like, well, just 1 second before you pull the trigger. You're having a problem with that oil heater, aren't you? Yeah. I can construct a non-coagulating oil furnace for you. Okay, we'll give you another couple years. That's how he survived. He was that brilliant. But the entirety of his career was pointing to these Russian icons and saying, they're not there for politicization. They're not there for your aesthetic pleasure. They're there to put you in touch with the prototype. So what Michael said, dare yourself. Spend some time with them. Pray in front of them. That's what Florensky would have advised until, of course, he was killed in 1937 by Stalin's henchmen. Tragically, this brief moment of communist appeal to the icon ultimately was too abstract. And so, instead of the red wedge defeating the bourgeoisie in white, you have now the red soldiers beating back the rich financiers, and then you have crass Soviet realism, because the icon was too daring for them. And that's what gives us everybody's favorite painting. Roses for Stalin. That realist style was harvested. And the icon goes underground. And I'm kind of glad that it went underground, because when they started to pile up the icons in bins and burn them as evidences of an atheistic state, evidences of a Christian history that has now been superseded, as St. Petersburg that cathedral became a museum, looking back upon the past now that we've graduated to atheism, I look at your icons and say, would they have survived if they had stayed in Russia? Probably not. Probably not. There is so much more we could say. Believe it or not far from us, there is the Louis Sullivan Russian Orthodox Cathedral, where one of the original and most important icons, thank you, was kept during communism. Look at that. 1949 to 2004, this one of the most important icons in Russian Orthodoxy was kept in Chicago. I never went to see it. It's one of the great disappointments of my life. I never will see it. I don't think in this life. But it was actually kept here because people were bringing icons to this city to preserve them at a time where they were being destroyed. And now your collection takes part in that history. Interestingly enough, here's a depiction of Louis Sullivan and John of Chicago in the great church. And the entire history of what I just said can be communicated if you go to this Russian Orthodox church. Because look at that. That's the westernized aesthetic on their iconostasis. And there is the style of icons that has been capitulating to the Western aesthetic. You can see it here. And here is the icon that has been recovered. The original in 2004 was taken back to Russia to great fanfare. They received it. And this is a copy that is now kept at Louis Sullivan's Trinity Orthodox Church. And your history with icons now takes place alongside of this one. Just look at that difference, you see? Russia rediscovered the icon, and we can rediscover it as well. Let me just crank it up for our last minute, just to intensify things a little bit further. And this is a hard note to end on, so we'll turn it around briefly. But I'm sorry to tell you that icon that returned to Russia, there is a depiction of it in the Russian Cathedral of the Armed Forces being used to defend and, we now know, attack Ukraine. Icons are being deployed in this war. I can point you to so many news articles about this. I kind of wish we kept it here. That great icon. And when I bring that up to students and when I bring it up to you, I say, I'm glad we now only have a copy here. I'm glad that these icons have been preserved from that politicization that they might have experienced even if they had survived in Russia. And I know the Christians at Louis Sullivan's church, they are not militaristic. I'm sure they're uncomfortable with some of the ways their icons are being used. Oh, but how they are being used. There's a procession where they take those icons out and chastise the domineering skyscrapers with the gift of humility. They blessed the waters of Lake Michigan. And now all those Orthodox Christians have gathered. You are part of that tradition too. Maybe you need to do a procession down to Lake Michigan with the icons. Yes, we're all in this together. We get politicized in any part of the church. These icons have a purity. I hope you've gotten a window into that, and I hope you don't just admire them. I hope that you can use them. Thank you so much.
Thank you.